The floorboard creaked at 2 a.m., and Margaret Duval nearly stopped breathing. She lay rigid in her bed, listening to the sound roll through the farmhouse like a gunshot through silence, waiting for the boots on the stairs, the fists on the door. The German patrol that had been sweeping this stretch of the Norman countryside for 3 straight nights looking for the wounded soldier who had vanished from a crashed reconnaissance vehicle somewhere near her father's back pasture. The soldier lying beneath her floorboards, 6 inches below her own mattress, in a crawlspace her grandfather had built during the last war for exactly this kind of emergency, did not make another sound. He had learned, in the 11 days she had kept him hidden, to hold himself perfectly still through the long nights when patrols came sniffing through the village. And Margaret had learned, in that same span of time, to hate herself a little less for what she was risking every single hour he remained under her roof. His name was Erich Bauer, and he was 22 years old, and he was, technically, the enemy, a German officer whose unit had been ambushed by a resistance cell 3 kilometers from her family's farm, whose comrades had either died in the wreckage or been captured and executed in the chaos of the firefight, and who had crawled, bleeding and half-conscious, into her father's turnip field in the gray hour before dawn 11 days ago, and who Margaret, against every instinct her country's occupation had beaten into her, had chosen not to report. She still didn't fully understand why. It would have been easy to walk to the village and tell the German garrison exactly where their missing officer lay dying in a French farmer's field. It would have earned her family goodwill, extra rations, the kind of protection that came from cooperation in a country starving under occupation. Her own brother, Jean, had been taken to a labor camp in Germany 8 months earlier for the crime of being 19 and able-bodied, and every rational calculation available to Margaret in that gray dawn should have told her that helping this soldier was madness, that his uniform made him responsible in some diffuse and terrible way for everything her family had lost. Instead, she had knelt beside him in the mud, checked the wound in his side, and made a decision that would haunt and define the rest of her life before she had even fully articulated it to herself. She would not let a wounded boy die alone in a field, whatever flag he wore. She told herself it was simply mercy, uncomplicated by politics. She told herself this for 11 days, repeating it like a prayer each time she carried food down to the crawlspace, each time she changed the dressing on his wound by candlelight, each time she pressed a hand over his mouth to muffle a groan of pain when German patrols passed close enough to the farmhouse that even breathing felt dangerous. But mercy, she was learning, had a way of growing into something more complicated the longer you sat with it in the dark. Erich spoke passable French, learned from a tutor his mother had hired before the war, back when his family still believed education was the currency of a decent future, rather than a luxury the world no longer had patience for. He told her, in fragments across those long hidden days, about a home in Freiburg he wasn't certain still existed, about a younger sister he hadn't heard from in months, about a war he had been conscripted into rather than chosen, a war that had already taken more from him than he had ever imagined possible when he first put on the uniform, believing, foolishly, that duty and decency could coexist inside it. "I did not want this," he told her one night, his voice barely above a whisper, his face pale from blood loss and fever in the flickering candlelight. "I want you to know that, whatever happens to me, I did not want any of this." Margaret did not fully believe him at first. She had lost too much to this war, watched too many soldiers in that same gray uniform march through her village with rifles slung and faces empty of anything resembling doubt, to extend easy trust to any man wearing it. But she watched Erich Bauer across 11 days of proximity that no propaganda poster could survive, watched him wince with guilt rather than pride when he described the ambush that had killed his men, watched him ask after her brother with what seemed like genuine, aching concern rather than performance, and slowly, carefully. The wall inside her began to develop the same hairline fractures that every human wall develops when forced to withstand the relentless pressure of another person's undeniable humanity. The patrol on the 11th night was different from the others. It did not simply pass through the village and move on. It stopped. Margaret heard the trucks first, engines idling in the yard below her window, and then the voices, clipped, authoritative German mixed with the frightened French of her father being questioned at the front door, his voice climbing toward the particular register of a man trying desperately to sound like he has nothing to hide. She was down the stairs before she had consciously decided to move, positioning herself in the kitchen doorway where she could see the German officer standing in her family's entryway, flanked by two soldiers with rifles held loose but ready, his eyes moving methodically across the room with the practiced efficiency of a man who had searched 100 farmhouses before this one and expected to search 100 more. His name, she would later learn, was Hauptmann Kruger, and he was searching specifically for a missing reconnaissance officer whose disappearance had become, in the 11 days since the ambush, a matter of increasing frustration for the regional command. He had reason to believe, based on tracks found near the wreckage, that the missing man had crawled in the direction of the Duval farm before the trail went cold in the rain. "We have searched your barn," Kruger said, his French clipped and formal, addressing Margaret's father but watching Margaret herself with an attentiveness that made her stomach drop. "We have searched your cellar. We would like to search the house." Margaret's father, Henry Duval, a weathered man who had fought in the First War and buried a wife 3 years into the Second, held his ground with the particular stubbornness of a farmer who had spent his whole life negotiating with forces larger than himself, weather, debt, occupation. "Search whatever you like, Hauptmann. We have nothing to hide." The lie sat in the room like a held breath. They searched for 40 minutes. Margaret stood in the kitchen doorway the entire time, hands folded to keep them from shaking, listening to boots move through her home, through her bedroom. Across the exact floorboards beneath which Erich Bauer lay silent and still in a crawlspace 6 inches beneath the frame of her own bed, his wounded body pressed against packed earth. His breath, she prayed. She prayed with an intensity she had not summoned since her mother's funeral, held as carefully controlled as a held breath could ever be held by a man running a fever. Kruger's boots stopped directly above the crawlspace. Margaret felt the floor groan faintly beneath his weight, and for one suspended, endless moment, she was certain the search was over, certain the trapdoor concealed beneath her bed frame's heavy oak base would be discovered, certain her family's farm and possibly her family's lives were about to end because of a decision she had made in a muddy field 11 days earlier that she still could not fully explain even to herself. Kruger looked down at the floor. He looked at the bed frame, old and heavy and clearly original to the house, immovable without significant effort. He looked, finally, at Margaret standing frozen in the doorway, and something passed across his face that she would spend years afterward trying to interpret. Suspicion, certainly, but also something like exhaustion, the particular weariness of a man who had spent 4 years of war searching farmhouses for enemies who sometimes turned out to be nothing more than frightened civilians protecting their own fragile lives however they could. "Nothing," he said finally to the soldier beside him, and turned and walked out of the room. They left the farm 20 minutes later, engines fatting down the lane into the darkness, and Margaret did not move from the doorway until the sound had disappeared entirely, and then her legs gave out beneath her, and she sank to the kitchen floor and did not cry, could not cry, simply sat there shaking in the aftermath of a fear so total it had briefly emptied her of every other feeling. When she finally climbed the stairs and lifted the trapdoor, Erich Bauer was weeping silently in the dark, his face streaked with tears he had not been able to release while the search moved through the house above him, terrified that even the sound of his own crying might be the thing that killed the woman who had risked everything to save him. "I heard him standing there," Erich whispered. "I have never been so afraid, not in the ambush, not watching my men die, Nothing has ever frightened me the way that moment frightened me, because if he had found me, he would have killed you too, and I could not have stopped it, and I could not have lived with that." Something in the way he said it, not fear for himself, but fear for her, finished the work that 11 days of proximity had already begun. Margaret moved him 3 nights later to a resistance contact in the next village. A decision made jointly with her father after long, careful conversation about the mounting danger of keeping him at the farm, about the growing suspicion in Kruger's eyes, about the reality that their luck could not hold indefinitely against repeated searches. The resistance network, it turned out, had its own uses for a German officer disillusioned enough with his own army to provide information about troop movements and garrison strength. And Erich Bauer spent the final year of the war working, quietly and at extraordinary risk to himself, as a source for the very resistance cell whose ambush had nearly killed him. Margaret did not see him again until 3 months after the liberation, when he appeared at her family's farm gate in civilian clothes borrowed from a resistance fighter, thinner than she remembered, older around the eyes in the way everyone who survived that war seemed permanently older around the eyes, carrying nothing but a small bag and a letter he had been composing in his head. He told her, for the better part of a year. He did not ask her to marry him that day. He asked her instead if he could stay in the village long enough to prove that the man she had hidden beneath her floorboards was the same man standing in front of her now, unarmed, unaffiliated with any army, asking nothing except the chance to become worthy of what she had already risked for him, without ever asking anything in return. She let him stay. It took 2 years of careful, patient rebuilding, of a country, of trust, of a relationship that had been forged in the particular crucible of war but needed, both of them understood, to prove it could survive the ordinary demands of peace. Before Margaret Duval agreed to marry Erich Bauer in the same small stone church where her own parents had married 3 decades earlier. A ceremony attended by a congregation still working through its own complicated grief about a war that had asked ordinary people to make impossible choices, and then judged them, afterward, for whichever choice they'd made. Not everyone approved. Margaret's own aunt refused to attend, unable to reconcile her niece's marriage with the memory of a brother who never came home from the labor camps, and Margaret understood that grief, carried it alongside her own happiness without ever asking her aunt to abandon it. Some wounds, she had learned in that crawlspace beneath her bed, did not close simply because a war ended. Some of them you simply learned to carry alongside whatever new thing life offered you afterward. Her brother Jean did come home, eventually, in the autumn of 1945, thin and hollowed by 2 years of forced labor. And it was Jean, surprisingly, who became Erich's fiercest defender in the years that followed, having spent enough time himself on the wrong side of arbitrary cruelty to recognize the difference between a system and the individual men trapped inside it. "He hid from his own army in your floorboards," Jean told their aunt once, at a family dinner grown tense with old grievances. "He spent a year risking execution to pass information to the people who nearly killed him. If that man is still your enemy, then I don't know what the word means anymore." Margaret and Erich stayed in Normandy for the rest of their lives, running the farm that had once hidden him, raising 3 children who grew up playing in the same crawlspace their mother had once used to save their father's life. A piece of family history told and retold at dinner tables until it stopped feeling like history at all, and became simply the story of how their parents met, dramatic, improbable, and entirely, unmistakably true. Margaret kept the trapdoor unrepaired for the rest of her life, though the crawlspace itself was eventually filled with old furniture and forgotten boxes, because some part of her could never quite bring herself to seal away the space that it held, for 11 of the most dangerous nights of her life, the frightened, wounded, undeniably human boy who would become the great love of the rest of it. She told her grandchildren, decades later, sitting by the same farmhouse hearth where she had once listened for German boots on gravel, that the hardest and most important lesson the war ever taught her was this: that uniforms could disguise a man's allegiance, but they could never fully disguise his heart, and that the bravest thing a person could do in the darkest hour of the worst century humanity had ever survived was to look past the fabric and see, underneath it, simply another frightened human being worth saving.